Emma, written by Jane Austen, read by the staff of Birmingham Libraries, Volume 2, Chapter 13. Emma continued to entertain no doubt of her being in love. Her ideas only varied as to the how much. At first she thought it was a good deal, and afterwards but little. She had great pleasure in hearing Frank Churchill talked of, and, for his sake, greater pleasure than ever in seeing Mr. and Mrs. Weston. She was very often thinking of him, and quite impatient for a letter, that she might know how he was, how were his spirits, how was his aunt, and what was the chance of him coming to Randalls again this spring. But, on the other hand, she could not admit herself to be unhappy, nor, after the first morning, to be less disposed for employment than usual. She was still busy and cheerful, and, pleasing as he was, she could yet imagine him to have faults. And further, though thinking of him so much, and, as she sat drawing or working, forming 1,000 amusing schemes for the progress and close of their attachment, fancying interesting dialogues and inventing elegant letters, the conclusion of every imaginary declaration on his side was that she refused him. Their affection was always to subside into friendship. Everything tender and charming was to mark their parting, but still they were to part. When she became sensible of this, it struck her that she could not be very much in love, for, in spite of her previous and fixed determination never to quit her father, never to marry, a strong attachment certainly must produce more of a struggle than she could foresee in her own feelings. "I do not find myself making any use of the word sacrifice," said she. "In not one of all my clever replies, my delicate negatives, is there any allusion to making a sacrifice. I do suspect that he is not really necessary to my happiness. So much the better. I certainly will not persuade myself to feel more than I do. I am quite enough in love. I should be sorry to be more." Upon the whole, she was equally contented with her view of his feelings. He is undoubtedly very much in love. Everything denotes it. Very much in love indeed. And when he comes again, if his affection continue, I must be on my guard not to encourage it. It would be most inexcusable to do otherwise, as my own mind is quite made up. Not that I imagine he can think I have been encouraging him. No, if he had believed me at all to share his feelings, he would not have been so wretched. Could he have thought himself encouraged, his looks and language at parting would have been different. Still, however, I must be on my guard. This is in the supposition of his attachment continuing what it is now, but I do not know that I expect it will. I do not look upon him to be quite the sort of man. I do not altogether build upon his steadiness or constancy. His feelings are warm, but I can imagine them rather changeable. Every consideration of the subject, in short, makes me thankful that my happiness is not more deeply involved. I shall do very well again after a little while, and then it will be a good thing over, for they say everybody is in love once in their lives, and I shall have been let off easily." When his letter to Mrs. Weston arrived, Emma had the perusal of it, and she read it with a degree of pleasure and admiration which made her at first shake her head over her own sensations, and think she had undervalued their strength. It was a long, well-written letter, giving the particulars of his journey and of his feelings, expressing all the affection, gratitude, and respect which was natural and honourable, and describing everything exterior and local that could be supposed to be attractive, with spirit and precision. No suspicious flourishing now of apology or concern. It was the language of real feeling towards Mrs. Weston, and the transition from Highbury to Enscombe, the contrast between the places in some of the first blessings of social life, was just enough touched on to show how keenly it was felt, and how much more might have been said but for the restraints of propriety. The charm of her own name was not wanting. Miss Woodhouse appeared more than once, and never without something of pleasing connection. either a compliment to her taste or a remembrance of what she had said. And in the very last time of it meeting her eye, unadorned as it was by any such broad wreath of gallantry, she yet could discern the effect of her influence, and acknowledge the greater compliment perhaps of all conveyed. Compressed into the very lowest vacant corner were these words: "I had not a spare moment on Tuesday, as you know, for Miss Woodhouse's beautiful friend. Pray make my excuses and adieus to her." This, Emma could not doubt, was all for herself. Harriet was remembered only as being her friend. His information and prospects as to Enscombe were neither worse nor better than had been anticipated. Mrs. Churchill was recovering, and he dared not yet, even in his own imagination, fix a time for coming to Randalls again. Gratifying, however, and stimulative as was the letter in its material part, its sentiments she yet found, when it was folded up and returned to Mrs. Weston, that it had not added any lasting warmth, that she could still do without the writer, and that he must learn to do without her. Her intentions were unchanged. Her resolution of refusal only grew more interesting by the addition of a scheme for his subsequent consolation and happiness. His recollection of Harriet, and the words which clothed it, the beautiful little friend, suggested to her the idea of Harriet succeeding her in his affections. Was it impossible? No. Harriet undoubtedly was greatly his inferior in understanding, but he had been very much struck with the loveliness of her face and the warm simplicity of her manner, and all the probabilities of circumstance and connection were in her favour. For Harriet it would be an advantageous and delightful indeed. "I must not dwell on it," said she. "I must not think of it. I know the danger of indulging such speculations. But stranger things have happened, and when we cease to care for each other as we do now, it will be the means of confirming us in that true sort of disinterested friendship which I can already look forward to with pleasure." It was well to have a comfort in store on Harriet's behalf, though it might be wise to let the fancy touch it seldom, for evil in that quarter was at hand. As Frank Churchill's arrival had succeeded Mr. Elton's engagement in the conversation of Highbury, as the latest interest had entirely borne down the first, so now, upon Frank Churchill's disappearance, Mr. Elton's concerns were assuming the most irresistible form. His wedding day was named. He would soon be among them again, Mr. Elton and his bride. There was hardly time to talk over the first letter from Enscombe before Mr. Elton and his bride was in everybody's mouth, and Frank Churchill was forgotten. Emma grew sick at the sound. She had had 3 weeks of happy exemption from Mr. Elton, and Harriet's mind, she had been willing to hope, had been lately gaining strength. With Mr. Weston's ball in view, at least, there had been a great deal of insensibility to other things, but it was now too evident that she had not attained such a state of composure as could stand against the actual approach, new carriage, bell ringing, and all. Poor Harriet was in a flutter of spirits which required all the reasonings and soothings and attentions of every kind that Emma could give. Emma felt that she could not do too much for her, that Harriet had a right to all her ingenuity and patience, but it was heavy work to be for ever convincing without producing any effect, for ever agreed to without being able to make their opinions the same. Harriet listened submissively and said it was very true. It was just as Miss Woodhouse described. It was not worth while to think about them, and she would think about them any longer. But no change of subject could avail, and the next half hour saw her as anxious and restless about the Eltons as before. At last Emma attacked her on another ground. "Your allowing yourself to be so occupied and so unhappy about Mr. Elton's marrying Harriet is the strongest reproach you can make of me. You could not give me greater reproof for the mistake I fell into. It was all my doing, I know. I have not forgotten it, I assure you. Deceiving myself, I did very miserably deceive you. and it will be a painful reflection to me forever. Do not imagine me in danger of forgetting it." Harriet felt this too much to utter more than a few words of eager exclamation. Emma continued, "I have not said, 'Exert yourself, Harriet, for my sake.' Think less, talk less of Mr. Elton for my sake, because, for your own sake rather, I would wish it to be done, for the sake of what is more important than my comfort, a habit of self-command in you, a consideration of what is your duty, an attention to propriety, an endeavour to avoid the suspicion of others, to save your health and credit, and restore your tranquillity. These are the motives that I have been pressing on you. They are very important, and sorry I am that you cannot feel them sufficiently to act upon them. My being saved from pain is a very secondary consideration. I want you to save yourself from greater pain. Perhaps I may sometimes felt that Harriet would not forget what was due, or rather, that would be kind by me." This appeal to her affection did more than all the rest. The idea of wanting gratitude and consideration from Miss Woodhouse, whom she really loved, made her wretched for a while, and when the violence of grief was comforted away, still remained powerful enough to prompt what was right, and support her in it very tolerably. "You, who have been the greatest friend I ever had in my life, want gratitude to you? No one is equal to you. I care for nobody as I care for you. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, how ungrateful I have been." Such expressions, assisted as they were by everything that look and manner could do, made Emma feel that she had never loved Harriet so well, nor valued her affection so highly before. "There is no charm equal to tenderness of heart," said she afterwards to herself. "There is nothing to be compared to it. Warmth and tenderness of heart, with an affectionate open manner, will beat all the clearness of head in the world for attraction. I am sure it will. It is tenderness of heart which makes my dear father so generally beloved, which gives Isabella her popularity. I have it not, but I know how to prize and respect it. Harriet is my superior in all the charm and all the felicity it gives. Dear Harriet, I would not change you for the clearest-headed, longest-sighted, best-judging female breathing. Oh, the coldness of a Jane Fairfax! Harriet is worth 100 such, and for a wife, a sensible man's wife, it is invaluable. I mention no names, but happy the man who changes Emma for Harriet."
This is Emma, written by Jane Austen and read by staff from Birmingham Libraries. This is volume number 2, chapter 14. Mrs. Elton was first seen at church, but though devotion might be interrupted, curiosity could not be satisfied by a bride in a pew, and it must be left for the visits in form of which were then to be paid, to settle that she were very pretty indeed, or only rather pretty, or not very pretty at all. Emma had feelings, less of curiosity than of pride or propriety, to make her resolve on not being the last to pay her respects, and she made a point of Harriet's going with her, that the worst of the business might be gone through as soon as possible. She could not enter the house again, could not be in the same room to which she had with such vain artifice retreated 3 months ago, to lace up her boot, without recollecting. 1,000 vexatious thoughts would recur, compliments, charades, and horrible blunders, and it was not to be supposed that poor Harriet should not be recollecting too. But she behaved very well, and was only rather pale and silent. The visit was of course short, and there was so much embarrassment and occupation of mind to shorten it, that Emma would not allow herself entirely to form an opinion of the lady, and on no account to give one, beyond the nothing-meaning terms of being elegantly dressed and very pleasing. She did not really like her, but would not be in a hurry to find fault, but she suspected that there was no elegance, ease, but no elegance. She was almost sure that for a young woman, a stranger, a bride, there was too much ease. Her person was rather good, her face was not unpretty, but neither feature, nor air, nor voice, nor manner were elegant. Emma thought at least it would turn out so. As for Mr. Elton, his manners did not appear, But no, she would not permit a hasty or witty word from herself about his manners. It was an awkward ceremony at any time to be receiving wedding visits, and a man had need to be all grace to acquit himself well through it. The woman was better off. She might have the assistance of fine clothes and the privilege of bashfulness, but the man had only his own good sense to depend on. And when she considered how peculiarly unlucky poor Mr. Alton was in being in the same room at once with the woman he had just married, the woman that he wanted to marry, and the woman whom he had been expected to marry, she must allow him to have the right to look a little wise, and to be as much affectedly and as little easy as could be. "Well, Mrs. Woodhouse," said Harriet, when they had quitted the house, and after waiting in vain for her friend to begin. "Well, Mrs. Woodhouse," with a gentle sigh, "what do you think of her? Is she not very charming?" There was a little hesitation in Emma's answer. "Oh, yes, a very pleasing young woman." "I think her beautiful, quite beautiful." "Very nicely dressed, indeed, a remarkably elegant gown. I'm not surprised at all that he should have fallen in love." "Oh, no, there is nothing to surprise one at all. A pretty fortune, and she came in his way." "I dare say," returned Harriet, sighing again, "I dare say that she was very much attached to him." "Perhaps she might, but it is not every man's fate to marry the woman who loves him best. Miss Hawkins perhaps wanted a home, and thought that this was the best offer she was likely to have." "Yes," said Harriet earnestly, "and well, she might. Nobody could have ever had a better. Well, I wish them happy with all my heart. And now, Miss Woodhouse, I do not think I shall mind seeing them again. He's just as superior as ever, but being married, you know, it is quite a different thing. No, indeed, Miss Woodhouse, you need not be afraid. I can sit and admire him now with any great misery, to know that he has not thrown himself away in such a comfort. She does seem a charming young woman, just what he deserves. Happy creature, he called her Augusta. How delightful." When the visit was returned, Emma made up her mind. She could then see more and judge better. From Harriet's happening not to be at Hartfield, and her father's being present to engage Mr. Alton, she had a quarter of an hour of the lady's conversation to herself, and could composedly attend to her, and the quarter of an hour quite convinced her that Mrs. Alton was a vain woman, extremely well satisfied in herself, and thinking much of her own importance, that she was meant to shine and be very superior, but with manners which had been formed in a bad school, pert and familiar, that all her notions were drawn from one set of people and one style of living, that if not foolish, she was ignorant, and that her society would certainly do Mr. Alton no good. Harriet would have been a better match. If not wise or refined herself, she would have connected him with those who were. But Miss Hawkins, it might be fairly supposed from her easy conceit, had been the best of her own set. The rich brother-in-law near Bristol was the pride of the alliance, and his place and his carriages were the pride of him. The very first subject after being seated was Maple Grove. My brother, Mr. Suckling's seat, a comparison of Hartfield to Maple Grove. The grounds of Hartfield were small, but neat and pretty, and the house was modern and very well built. Mrs. Alton seemed most favourably impressed by the size of the room, the entrance, and all that she could see or imagine. Very like Maple Grove indeed. She was quite struck by the likeness. That room was the very shape and size of the morning room at Maple Grove, her sister's favourite room. Mr. Alton was appealed to. Was not it astonishingly alike? She could really almost fancy herself at Maple Grove. And the staircase! You know, as I came in, I observed how very much like the staircase was, placed exactly in the same part of the house. I really could not help exclaiming. I assure you, Miss Woodhouse, it is very delightful to me to be reminded of a place I am so extremely partial to as Maple Grove. I spent so many happy months there, with a little sigh of sentiment. A charming place, undoubtedly. Everybody who sees it is struck by its beauty. But to me, it has been quite like a home. Whenever you are transplanted like me, Miss Woodhouse, you will understand how very delightful it is to meet anything at all like one has left behind. I always say this is quite one of the evils of matrimony." Emma made as slight as a reply as she could, but it was fully sufficient for Mrs. Elton, who only wanted to be talking to herself. "So extremely like Maple Grove, and it's not merely the house. The grounds, I assure you, as far as I could observe, are strikingly alike. The laurels at Maple Grove are in the same profusion as here, and stand very much in the same way, just across the lawn. And I had a glimpse of the fine large tree with a bench around it, which put me so exactly in mind. My brother and sister will be enchanted with this place. People who have extensive grounds themselves are always pleased with anything in the same style." Emma doubted the truth of this sentiment. She had a great idea that people who had extensive grounds themselves cared very little for the extensive grounds of anybody else. But it was not worth while to attack an error so double-dyed, and therefore only said in reply, "When you have seen more of this country, I am afraid you will think you have overrated Hartfield. Surrey is full of beauties." "Oh, yes, I am quite aware of that. It is the Garden of England, you know. Surrey is the Garden of England." "Yes, but we must not rest our claims on that distinction. Many countries, I believe, are called the Garden of England, as well as Surrey." "No, I fancy not," replied Mrs. Elton with a most satisfied smile. "I never heard any country but Surrey called so." Emma was silenced. "My brother and sister have promised us a visit in the spring, or summer at farthest," continued Mrs. Elton, "and there will be a time for exploring while they are with us. We shall explore a great deal, I dare say. They will have their baroche landau, of course, which holds four perfectly, and therefore, without saying anything of our carriage, we shall be able to explore the different beauties extremely well. They will hardly come in their chaise, I think, at that season of the year. Indeed, when the time draws on, I shall decidedly recommend their bringing of the baroche landau, as it will be very much preferable. When people come into a beautiful country of this sort, you know, Mrs. Woodhouse, one naturally wishes them to see as much as possible, and Mr. Suckling is extremely fond of exploring. We explored to King's Weston twice last summer, in that way, most delightfully, just after the first having the baroche landau. You have many parties of that kind here, I suppose, Miss Woodhouse, every summer?" "No, not immediately here. We are rather out of distance of the very striking beauties which attract the sort of parties you speak of, and we are a very quiet set of people, I believe, more disposed to stay at home than engage in schemes of pleasure." "Ah, there is nothing like staying at home for real comfort. Nobody can be more devoted to home than I am. I was quite a proverb for it at Maple Grove. Many a time had Selina said, when she'd been going to Bristol, 'I really cannot get this girl to move from the house. I absolutely must go in by myself, though I hate being stuck up in the baroche landau without a companion.' But Augusta, I believe, with her own good will, would never stir beyond the park paling. Many a time she had said so, and yet I am no advocate for entire seclusion. I think, on the contrary, when people shut themselves up entirely from society, it is a very bad thing, and that it is much more reversible to mix in the world in a proper degree, without living in it either too much or too little. I perfectly understand your situation, however, Mrs. Woodhouse," looking towards Mr. Woodhouse. "Your father's state of health must be a great drawback. Why does he not try Bath? Indeed he should. Let me recommend Bath to you. I assure you, I have no doubt of its doing Mr. Woodhouse good. My father tried it more than once, formerly, but without receiving any benefit, and Mr. Perry, whose name I dare say is not unknown to you, does not conceive it will be any more likely to be useful now." "Ah, that is a great pity, for I assure you, Miss Woodhouse, where the waters do agree, it is quite wonderful the relief they give. In my Bath life I have seen such instances of it. It is so cheerful a place that it could not fail you being used to Mr. Woodhouse's spirits, which I understand are sometimes much depressed. And as to its recommendations to you, I understand I need not to take the pains to dwell on them. The advantages of Bath to the young are pretty generally understood. It would be a charming introduction for you, who have lived so secluded a life, and I could immediately secure you some of the best society at the place. A line from me would bring you a little host of acquaintance, and my particular friend, Mrs. Partridge, the lady I have always resided with when in Bath, would be most happy to shew you any attentions, and would be the very best person for you to go into public with." It was as much as Emma could bear without being impolite. The idea of her being indebted to Mrs. Elton for what was called an introduction, of her going into public under the auspice of a friend of Mrs. Elton, probably some vulgar, dashing widow who, with the help of a boarder, just made a shift to live. The dignity of Miss Woodhouse of Hartfield was sunk indeed. She restrained herself, however, from any of the reproof she could have given, and only thanked Mrs. Elton coolly. But their going to Bath was quite out of the question, and she was not perfectly convinced that the place might suit her better than her father. And then, to prevent further outrage and indignation, changed the subject directly. "I do not ask whether you were musical, Mrs. Elton. Upon these occasions a lady's character generally precedes her, and Highbury has long known that you were a superior performer." "Oh, no, indeed, I must protest against any such idea. A superior performer? Very far from it, I assure you, considering from how partial a quarter your information came. I am dotingly fond of music, passionately fond, and my friends say I am not entirely devoid of taste, but as to anything else, upon my honour, my performance is mediocre to the last degree." "You, Miss Woodhouse, I know play delightfully. I assure you it has been the greatest satisfaction, comfort, and delight to me to hear what a musical society I am got into. I absolutely cannot do without music. It is so necessary to my life, and having always been used to a very musical society, both at Maple Grove and in Bath, I would have been most at serious sacrifice." I honestly said as much to Mr. E. when he was speaking of my future home, and expressing his fears lest the retirement of it should be disagreeable, and the inferiority of the house too, knowing what I have been accustomed to. Of course, he was not wholly without apprehension. When he was speaking of it in that way, I honestly said the world I could give up, parties, balls, plays, for I had no fear of retirement. Blessed with so many resources within myself, the world was not necessary to me. I could do very well without it. To those who had no resource, it was a different thing, but my resources made me quite independent. And as to smaller sized rooms than I'd been used to, I really could not give it a thought. I hoped I was perfectly equal to any sacrifice of that description. Certainly I had been accustomed to every luxury at Maple Grove, but I did assure him that 2 carriages were not necessary to my happiness, nor were spacious apartments. "But," said I, "to be quite honest, I do not think I can live without something of a musical society. I condition for nothing else. But without music, life would be blank to me." "We cannot suppose," said Emma, smiling, "that Mr. Elton would hesitate to assure you of there being a very musical society in Highbury, and I hope you will not find that he has outstepped the truth more than be pardoned in consideration of the motive." "No, indeed, I've no doubts at all on that head. I am delighted to find myself in such a circle. I hope we shall have many sweet little concerts together. I think, Miss Woodhouse, you and I should establish a musical club, and have regular weekly meetings at your house, or ours. Will it not be a good plan? If we exert ourselves, I think we shall not be in long want of allies. Something of that nature would be particularly desirable for me, and an inducement to keep me in practice. For married women, you know, there is a sad story against them in general. They are but too apt to give up music." "But you, who are so extremely fond of it, there could be no danger, surely?" "I should hope not, but really, when I look around amongst my acquaintance, I tremble. Selina has entirely given up music, never touches the instrument, though she played sweetly, and the same may be said of Mrs. Jeffreys, Carla Partridge, that was, and of the 2 Millans now, Mrs. Bird and Mrs. James Cooper, and of more than I can enumerate. Upon my word, it is enough to put one in fright. I used to be quite angry with Selina, but really I begin now to comprehend that a married woman has many things called to her attention. I believe I was half an hour this morning shut up with my housekeeper. But everything of that kind, said Emma, will soon be in so regular a train. Well, said Mrs. Elton, laughing, we shall see. Emma, finding her so determined upon neglecting her music, had nothing more to say, and, after a moment's pause, Mrs. Elton chose another subject. We've been calling at Randall's, said she, and found them both at home. A very pleasant people they seem to be. I like them extremely. Mr. Weston seems to be an excellent creature. Quite a first-rate favourite with me already, I assure you. And she speaks so truly. There is something so motherly and kind-hearted about her that wins upon one directly. She was your governess, I think? Emma was almost too astonished to answer, but Mrs. Elton hardly waited for the affirmative before she went on. Having understood as much, I was rather astonished to find her so very ladylike, but she is quite the gentlewoman. Mrs. Weston's manners, said Emma, were always particularly good. Their propriety, simplicity, and elegance would make them the safest model for any young woman. And who do you think came in while we were there? Emma was at quite a loss. The tone implied some old acquaintance, and how would she possibly guess? Knightley, continued Mrs. Elton. Knightley himself. Was not it lucky? For, not being with him when he called the other day, I had never seen him before, and of course, as so particular a friend of Mr. E.'s, I had great curiosity. My friend Knightley had been so often mentioned that I was really impatient to see him, and I must do my caro sposo so justice to say that he had never been ashamed of his friend. Knightley is quite the gentleman. I like him very much. Decidedly, I think, a very gentlemanlike man. Happily, it was now time to be gone. They were off, and Emma could breathe. Insufferable woman, was her immediate exclamation. Worse than I had supposed. Absolutely insufferable. Knightley. I could not have believed it. Knightley. Never seen him in her life before, and call him Knightley. And discover that he is a gentleman. A little upstart, vulgar being, with her Mr. E. and her caro sposo, and her resources, and her airs of pert pretension and underbred finery. I could not have believed it. And to propose that she and I to unite a form of musical club. One would fancy we were bosom friends, and Mrs. Weston, astonished that a person who brought me up could be such a gentlewoman. Worse and worse, I have met with her equal, much beyond my hopes. Harriet is disgraced by any companion. Oh, what would Frank Churchill say to her if he were here? How angry and how diverted he would be! Ah, there I am thinking of him directly. Always the first person to be thought of. How I catch myself out. Frank Churchill comes regularly into my mind. All this ran so glibly through her thoughts that by the time her father had arranged himself, after the bustle of the Eltons' departure, and was ready to speak, she was very tolerably capable of attending. Well, my dear, he deliberately began, considering we never saw her before, she seems a very pretty sort of young lady, and I dare say she is very much pleased with you. She speaks a little too quick. A little quickness of voice there would rather hurt the ear, but I believe I am nice. I do not like strange voices, and nobody speaks like you and poor Mrs. Taylor. However, she seems a very obliging, pretty behaved young lady, and no doubt will make him a very good wife, though I think he had better not have married. I made the best excuses I could for not having to be able to wait on him and Mrs. Elton on this happy occasion. I said that I hoped I should in the course of the summer, but I ought to have gone before, not to wait upon a bride and very remiss. Oh, it shews what a sad invalid I am. But I do not like the corner into Vicarage Lane. I dare say your apologies were accepted, sir, Mr. Elton knows you. Yes, but a young lady, a bride. I ought to have paid my respects to her if possible. It was being very deficient. But, my dear Papa, you are no friend to matrimony, and therefore you should be so anxious to pay your respects to a bride. I thought to be no recommendation to you. It is encouraging people to marry if you make so much of them. No, my dear, I never encouraged anybody to marry, but I would always wish to pay every proper attention to a lady, and a bride, especially, is never to be neglected. More is advertly to her. A bride, you know, my dear, is always the first in company. Let the others be who they may. Well, Papa, if this is not encouragement to marry, I do not know what is, and I should never have expected you to be lending my sanction to such vanity baits for poor young ladies. My dear, you do not understand me. This is a matter of mere common politeness and good breeding, and has nothing to do with my encouragement to people to marry. Emma had done. Her father was growing nervous, and could not understand her. Her mind returned to Mrs. Elton's offences, and long, very long did they occupy her.